The CRC has been in Canada for 120 years this year. It began in 1905 in southern Alberta, the same date as the establishment of that province. Hi, my name is Peter Bulthuis, past high school principal and director of church relations at World New Canada. I'm involved with the Toward CRC Canada group, which is an effort to create an autonomous CRC in and for Canada. The CRC here, like Canada itself, has seen a slow evolution toward autonomy. For Canada, full independence was the logical conclusion of that evolutionary process. Full autonomy has not yet been achieved for CRC Canada. My purpose here in this video is to show the distinctiveness of Canadian history and culture and how the collaborative nature of the Canadian culture is consistent with the collaborative nature of the Canadian CRC. The logical conclusion of the history of both is complete autonomy. The political entity known as Canada began with permanent French settlement in 1608, 417 years ago. But before that, relationships had already been defined between Indigenous folks and Europeans through the doctrine of discovery, which legitimized wholesale colonization and self-proclaimed ownership in the 15th and 16th century. That's part of our history. That said, though, in 1613, the Two-Row Wampum was an agreement that helped to redefine the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and Europeans in a respectful, autonomous partnership. That, too, is part of our history. For most of Canada's history, we were tied to a larger political entity as a colony. Then finally, in 1982, Canada got complete independence. That was the year we could change our own constitution, which might be analogous perhaps to a national synod. Here's how all of that worked. Canada began in 1608, 1642, 1670 with the founding of Quebec and Montreal and the Hudson Bay Company. The colonies were connected directly to the mother countries. And in 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham was fought and Britain was victorious and secured ownership of the whole colony. 1763, shortly after the battle, the Royal Proclamation gave limited recognition to Indigenous communities and established guidelines for nation-to-nation negotiations. 13 years later, the Quebec Act. The British allowed the French-speaking majority to retain their laws, religion, and language, a bit of autonomy, but not self-government. Things trundled along a bit till 1837, when both Upper and Lower Canada became a bit restless and displayed some rather un-Canadian behavior, rebellions, which resulted in some rather very British behavior, a commission, the report of Lord Durham, which extended a bit more self-government. 1867, Confederation, when the four colonies were banded together and received a constitution, the BNA Act, still ultimately colonies. The BNA Act gave the federal government responsibility for Indigenous peoples and lands, and 9 years later, the Indian Act pulled all the Indigenous policies together in one place. Then for 200 years, 1725, 1930, treaties were entered into between Indigenous groups and the government of the day. And then for more than 100 years, 1883, 1997, Indigenous residential schools through which 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their parents. Canada grew in 1869, 70, 71, 73, 98, 1905, 1949, 1999, and pieces of Canada were stitched together. 1919, just after the war, Canada decided and was allowed to join the League of Nations on their own. 1931, the Statute of Westminster allowed Canada to create its own foreign policy, a bit more autonomy than in 1965, the new flag was produced. Finally, 1982, the Patriotic Constitution. The BNA Act was given to Canada to change in any way it wanted to. Finally, full autonomy. But we continued to evolve. 2008, Prime Minister Harper publicly apologized residential schools. 2015, the report of the TRC Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation, with its 94 recommendations. 4 years later, the report on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in 2019. And then this year, in February, just now, a recognition of full title over Haida Gwaii by the Haida folks. So it's a long process, but 1982 saw the logical conclusion for Canada to the point where we recognize the importance and need for autonomy, not only for ourselves, but also for folks living within the political boundaries of what we call Canada, Turtle Island. The CRC in this country has been tracking a very similar history to where it now exists. Similar to Canadian history, the logical conclusion, which is the complete autonomy and self-governance to change both ecclesiastical and governance laws that we ourselves feel are at the intersection of Scripture and Canada. 1905, first CRC was established in southern Alberta. In 1926, Canada was proclaimed a mission field for the American CRC. In 1934, Canadian congregations were assigned to American classes. 1947, there were 14 CRCs in this country. By 1960, a scant 13 years later, there were 118 more, largely as a result of thousands of Dutch immigrants coming to Canada, often being supported by American CRCs. 1950, the first specifically Canadian classes were created by grouping together Canadian CRCs, but not every CRC in Canada thought it was a good idea. Throughout that early time, middle of last century, American CRCs were supporting the Canadian brothers and sisters through gifts of pews and psalter hymnals and communion sets and money from the Fund for Needy Churches, for which the Canadian CRCs were and are ever grateful, just like all folks are when others support them in times of insecurity. 1953, more Canadian classes. These classes did remain, however, tied to the Synod of the CRC, which was headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan. 1957, Synod said regional synods were a good idea, but 2 years later they said no, not a good idea. 1957 was also the year that several CRC Canadian pastors, one from the Netherlands, one from the States, strongly encouraged the Canadian CRCs to separate themselves from the CRCNA. 1966-67, the Council of CRCs in Canada, that is the CCRCC, was established, but was given no place in the structure of the CRCNA. 1990, still no place for this in the structure of the CRCNA, of the Council of CRCs in Canada. But Synod would consider in 1990 regional synods. 1993, they said no to regional synods. 1997, the Canadian Ministry Board was created to replace the CCRCC. 2 years later, that was stripped of all its power, as all authority structures remained with the agencies. It should be noted, too, that in the year 2000, the concern was officially voiced that there could be a drift to separation of Canada and United States churches. 2004, another shuffling of duties. In that year, the Canadian Ministry Director was quoted as saying he felt like a deputy rather than a director. 2011, more restructuring. 2022, an important quote from Synod, get this. As an ecclesiastical partner, CRCNA Canada is responsible to transact those matters assigned to them by Synod as it seeks to further its mission and ministry in Canada. By 2023, the structure is such that the CMB, Canadian Ministries Board, is able to manage and supervise agencies in Canada, but it and the agencies receive their mandates from and report to the bi-country, bi-national Synod. For almost 70 years, the separation requests have ebbed and flowed in Canada. SALT is the most recent iteration. Now it's time. Notwithstanding the relative freedom of the CMB, by country synod is 75-25. The American portion of the gathering will invariably outvote the Canadian one, although it does stand to reason that neither the Americans nor the Canadians vote as country-specific blocs. Synod sets the mandate for the CNB and the agencies, and the CNB does not necessarily answer to the Canadian churches. We're grateful for the support of the past, but we think now that at the synodical level, our contextual ministry potential is being hindered. The logical conclusion is a Canadian synod to which agencies and the CNB are related. The CRC in North America, particularly in Canada, has rested on the three strands or pillars: transformational, creedal, and pietist. There has historically been an emphasis on the transformational, riparian, if you wish, in Canada. Of late, the creedal strand has been the strongest in the CRC, the synod of which is dominated by the American CRCs. Enabling the transformational historical emphasis to flourish in concert with the other two is the logical conclusion in Canada. It does appear now, however, that the American cultural, religious, and political contexts are overshadowing two of these, emphasizing the creedal. The Canadian CRC has long done advocacy with the government. This is not inherently part of the history of the American CRC. To enable this to flourish again is a logical conclusion of the evolution of a Canadian CRC. The CRC has helped many global churches become established and encouraged them to thrive on their own. Just as Synod 24 spoke about equal partnerships among the CRCs across the globe, so the need to have and be recognized as having equal partnership with the American CRC is important. That separation is a logical conclusion of what Synod 24 decided. Even though the Canadian CRC is able to enter into ecclesiastical engagement with other Canadian denominations, the process for doing so and maintaining those relations is tied up in the complexities of the CRC's binationality. The logical conclusion is that a Canadian synod would discern the value of bilateral and multilateral engagement with other ecclesiastical entities. American steadfast belief in self-determination since 1918 means that a logical conclusion for the desire for Canadian CRC autonomy is that separate flourishing, which is good for both countries' CRCs. Ultimately, we can't restructure ourselves because we don't hold the ability to change our constitution, something that Canada was finally able to do in 1982. The logical conclusion of this long process is complete autonomy. It's time.